Fire does not ask who deserves to burn. Elira remembered that thought the moment the flames touched her arm, and she remembered it again, 17 years later, standing in a cold stone hallway, while her mother pinned a plain gray dress to her shoulders, like she was dressing a doll nobody wanted to keep. "Stand still," Vesa hissed, jabbing a pin too close to skin. "You are an embarrassment even now." Elira did not flinch. She had trained herself long ago not to flinch, not at pins, not at words, not at the mirror she avoided every morning, because it showed her the same thing it always showed her, a face, split by an old scar, that ran from her temple to her jaw, pale and rope-like, a permanent reminder of the night the east wing of her family's manor caught fire. She had been 6 years old. Her older sister Odalise had been trapped first, and their mother had run to save Odalise, the pretty one, the favored one, while Elira crawled through smoke alone, until a servant finally found her half-conscious near a collapsed beam. By the time anyone thought to look for her, the fire had already written its story into her skin. Nobody in the family ever apologized for choosing wrong. They simply decided, quietly and permanently, that Elira was the daughter who did not matter. "You will not speak unless spoken to," her mother continued, stepping back to examine her work with the same distaste she might give a stain on the carpet. "You will not look the king in the eye. You will stand at the very end of the line, and when he passes you by, as he surely will, you will bow and leave without a sound. Do you understand?" "I understand," Elira said quietly. Understanding was not the same as agreeing, but no one in that house had ever cared about the difference. Down the hall, her younger sister Naira was being fitted into a gown made of deep sapphire silk, her dark hair pinned with jewels that caught the candlelight like tiny captured stars. Naira was the family's real hope, the daughter they intended to offer to the Alpha King with pride, the one whose beauty had been polished and prepared for this exact moment, since she was old enough to understand what marriage meant among wolves. Elira was only being sent because tradition demanded that every eligible daughter of a noble pack attend the offering ceremony. Her father, Garin, had made that clear enough times that the words no longer stung, only settled into her chest like old, familiar stones. "You are going so the king's court does not question why we hid a daughter," he had told her the week before, not looking up from the ledger on his desk. "Not because anyone expects anything to come of it. Understand your place, and this will be over quickly." Elira understood her place. She had understood it since she was 6 years old, lying in a healer's bed while her mother wept over Odalise's minor burns in the next room, and never once came to check on her. The carriage ride to the Alpha King's stronghold took 2 days. Elira spent most of it staring out the window, watching the northern forests grow thicker and darker as they moved deeper into territory ruled by a king whose name alone made grown wolves lower their voices, King Kale. The Alpha who had unified 5 warring territories under one banner, through battles that were still spoken of in hushed, respectful tones. The king who, according to every rumor Elira had ever heard, had never shown mercy to an enemy, and never shown warmth to anyone at all. She was not afraid of him, not really. She had learned young that people who already believed she was worthless could not hurt her more than her own family already had. What she feared, quietly and privately, was the ceremony itself, the moment when dozens of women would stand in a row to be looked over like livestock, and she would be the one the king's eyes slid past without pausing, the one who would feel every eye in that grand hall land on her scarred face, and then look away in second-hand embarrassment. She had learned to survive many things. She was not certain she had learned to survive that. The stronghold appeared on the 3rd morning, and even Elira, who had trained herself not to feel much of anything toward her family's ambitions, found herself briefly stunned by its size. Black stone towers rose against a pale sky, banners marked with a silver wolf snapping in the wind, and a wall thick enough to withstand a siege of 100 years stretched around the entire fortress, like a promise that nothing gets in or out without the king's permission. Inside, the offered women were led to a preparation hall filled with mirrors, perfumes, and servants, moving quickly between dozens of noble daughters from every territory under the king's rule. Elira counted at least 40 women, each more beautiful than the last, each dressed in colors chosen to make her stand out. She was given a corner near the door, away from the mirrors, and no one seemed to mind that she had been placed there. No one seemed to notice her at all, which was, in its own strange way, a mercy. "You should cover your face more," Naira whispered to her at one point, adjusting her own reflection in a mirror 3 times the height of a grown man. "It would be kinder to everyone." Alira did not answer. She had learned that silence cost her nothing, while words handed to her sisters became weapons, sooner or later. A horn sounded somewhere deep in the stronghold, low and resonant, and the preparation hall fell into an immediate hush. A woman in gray robes, clearly some kind of steward, stepped through the doors and announced that the ceremony would begin within the hour. Excitement rippled through the room instantly, nervous laughter, and whispered hopes passing between women who had spent their entire lives being told that marrying the Alpha King would be the greatest honor a wolf could receive. Alira felt none of that excitement. She felt only the familiar tightening in her chest that came before every moment she was forced to be seen. When the doors to the great hall finally opened, the sight inside took her breath away despite herself. The hall was easily large enough to hold 1,000 wolves, its ceiling supported by black stone pillars carved with the shapes of running wolves, its floor polished to a mirror shine that reflected the light of 100 hanging lanterns. Nobles from every corner of the king's territory lined the walls, murmuring behind fans and goblets, watching the offered women file in with the same detached interest one might give to prize horses at auction. At the far end of the hall, on a raised dais of black stone, sat the throne, and on the throne sat the king. Alira had expected many things. She had not expected the way the entire hall seemed to grow quieter, simply from being in his presence, the way even the nobles who outranked most of the world in their own territories straightened when his eyes passed over them. King Kale sat with an ease that felt more dangerous than any show of aggression could have been, one arm resting along the throne, his expression carved from the same cold stone as the pillars around him. He was younger than she had expected, though age meant little among wolves who lived centuries, but there was nothing young about the weight in his gaze. He looked, Alira thought, like a man who had stopped expecting anything from a room the moment he entered it. The steward began calling names, and one by one the offered women stepped forward to be presented, walking a slow path toward the dais while the king watched without a flicker of visible interest. Some he studied for a long moment before waving them aside, others he barely glanced at. None of them received more than a few seconds of his attention, and each time a name was called, the tension in the room rose slightly higher, as if everyone present understood they were watching a man search for something he did not expect to find. Alira stood near the very end of the line, exactly where her mother had placed her, watching name after name called, watching daughter after daughter walk that long path and receive nothing but a passing glance. Naira was called somewhere in the middle of the line, and Alira watched her younger sister walk forward with practiced grace, chin lifted, exactly as she had been trained. The king's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than most, long enough that a ripple of interest passed through the crowd, long enough that Alira felt her mother's hand tighten with hope somewhere behind her. But then his attention moved on, and Naira was waved aside like all the rest, disappointment flickering across her face, before she smoothed it into practiced calm. The line grew shorter, the hall grew warmer, with the breath and heat of so many bodies pressed close together. Alira kept her eyes fixed on the floor, counting the black veins running through the polished stone, waiting for the moment this would finally be over. Alira, of House Varn. Her name landed in the hall like a stone dropped into still water. For one terrible second she did not move at all, some old animal instinct telling her that if she simply stayed still, no one would notice she existed. But the steward called her name again, sharper this time, and she had no choice but to step forward. She kept her shawl close around her shoulders as she walked, an old habit meant to keep the worst of her scarring shadowed from view, though it did nothing to hide the mark that ran along her jaw and temple. She heard the whispers begin almost immediately, soft at first, then less soft, nobles leaning toward one another to ask why such a girl had even been brought to the ceremony at all. She heard her mother's sharp intake of breath somewhere behind her, embarrassment radiating off the woman like heat from a flame. She kept walking anyway, because stopping now would only make it worse, and she had promised herself years ago that she would never give anyone the satisfaction of watching her break in public. She reached the base of the dais and stopped, exactly as she had been instructed, eyes lowered waiting for the king's gaze to slide past her the way it had slid past every unremarkable face in that hall. Instead, the hall went utterly silent. Alira felt it before she understood it, the shift in the air, the way the whispers around her cut off mid-sentence, as if someone had drawn a blade through sound itself. She risked a glance upward, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. King Kale was staring at her, the way a man stares at something he has been searching for his entire life, without knowing it. His entire body had gone still, in a way that felt different from the careful boredom he had shown every other woman in that line. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp and fixed and unmistakably fixed on her, and for the first time since she had entered the hall, Alira felt the terrible, unbearable weight of being truly seen. She did not know what to do with that. No one had ever looked at her like that before, not once in 23 years, and some deep, wary part of her immediately searched for the trick hidden inside it, because surely there was a trick. Surely a man like this, a king, feared across 5 territories, did not look at a scarred, unwanted daughter as if she were the only person in the room. The silence stretched long enough to become unbearable. Somewhere behind her, Alira heard her mother's sharp whisper, urging her to bow and step aside, to end the humiliation before it grew worse. She began to lower herself into the expected bow, ready to disappear back into the line where she belonged. The king rose from his throne. The sound of the hall's collective gasp was almost louder than the horn that had opened the ceremony. Nobles who had stood still and composed all evening now leaned forward, murmuring in open confusion, because in the entire history of the offering ceremony, no king had ever risen from that throne for anyone. Alira froze halfway into her bow, unsure whether to complete it or straighten, unsure of anything at all except the sound of her own heartbeat hammering in her ears. King Kale descended the steps of the dais slowly, deliberately, his eyes never once leaving her face, and the closer he came, the more Alira became aware of just how large he truly was, broad-shouldered and imposing, in a way that should have frightened her, and somehow, strangely, did not. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. She could hear her own pulse. She could hear the fabric of 1,000 gowns rustling, as every woman in that hall shifted to get a better view. She could hear, very faintly, her mother's breathing gone ragged with something that was not quite pride and not quite panic. "Look at me," King Kale said quietly, his voice low enough that it seemed meant only for her, though it carried through the silent hall regardless. "Not the floor, me." Alira lifted her chin, and the moment their eyes met fully, something in the king's expression shifted from disbelief into certainty, as though a question he had carried his entire life had just been answered. She had no way of knowing, standing there in her plain gray dress with her scar bared to 1,000 watching eyes, that her life had just changed forever. She only knew that for the first time since she was 6 years old, someone was looking at her, truly looking at her, and not looking away. The steward at the edge of the dais cleared his throat, a small, uncertain sound in a hall that had gone completely silent. He glanced toward the king, waiting for some signal, some indication of what to do next, because nothing in his years of service had prepared him for a moment like this. King Kale did not look at him. He did not look at anyone but Alira, his gaze moving slowly over her face, over the scar she had spent 17 years trying to hide, with an expression she could not read, and did not trust herself to name. Alira felt her pulse pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the hall could hear it. She searched his face for the reaction she had braced herself for her entire life, the flicker of disgust, the polite mask sliding into place before someone turned away, but none of it came. Instead there was only that same unbroken stillness, as if the king had forgotten, for the first time and longer than anyone in that hall could remember, how to move. Behind her, she heard her mother whisper something sharp to her father, though the words were too quiet to make out. She did not need to hear them to know what they meant. This was not supposed to happen. This moment belonged to Naira, to the daughter who had been polished and prepared and paraded for exactly this purpose. It was not supposed to belong to the daughter they had dressed in gray and hidden at the end of the line. Alira thought, briefly and absurdly, that she should apologize. The instinct was so deeply worn into her that it rose before she could stop it. Some old reflex built from years of being told she was an inconvenience simply by existing in a room. She swallowed the urge and stood still instead, chin lifted the way the king had told her to hold it, refusing to be the first one to look away. A murmur began to build again at the edges of the hall, quiet at first, then rising, nobles turning to whisper behind gloved hands, their voices carrying fragments of confusion and disbelief. Some of the offered women near the front of the line exchanged glances sharp enough to cut. Illyra caught sight of Nyra's face among them, her younger sister's carefully composed expression cracking for just a moment into something raw and furious before smoothing over again. The king raised one hand, and the hall fell silent again, as quickly as it had stirred. "Enough," he said, and though his voice was not loud, it carried to every corner of the great hall, with the ease of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "I did not ask for whispers. I asked for silence." Illyra watched, astonished despite herself, as 1,000 nobles obeyed instantly, straightening where they stood, folding their hands, lowering their eyes. She had grown up in a house where power meant cruelty, where authority was proven through humiliation and control. She had never seen power look like this before, quiet and absolute, requiring no cruelty at all to be obeyed. The king turned back to her, and for a moment, the rest of the hall seemed to fall away entirely, as if it were only the two of them standing there beneath the high black ceiling. "What is your name?" he asked again, though the steward had already announced it. His voice was quieter now, meant only for her, though it still reached every straining ear in that silent hall. "Illyra," she said, and was faintly surprised to hear her own voice come out steady. "Illyra, of House Varn." "Illyra," he repeated, as though testing the shape of the word, as though committing it to memory in a way that felt permanent. Something shifted behind his eyes, something that looked, impossibly, like relief. "Do you know why I have not moved from this spot?" She shook her head slowly, too honest and too unpracticed in matters of court to offer a clever answer, though a clever answer would have done her no good regardless. She had no idea what was happening. She only knew that every instinct she had built over 23 years of being overlooked was screaming that this could not be real, that somewhere a trick was waiting to reveal itself, that a man like this did not stop for a woman like her. "No," she admitted quietly, "I do not." King Kale studied her for one more long moment, and in the silence that followed, Illyra became aware of just how close he had drawn, close enough that she could see the strange gold flecks scattered through the gray of his eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him despite the chill of the stone hall around them. His wolf was near the surface, she realized with a small jolt of instinct, closer than any wolf she had ever stood beside outside of true intimacy. She did not understand what that meant yet. She would understand soon enough. The hall waited. Her family waited. 1,000 strangers who had never once looked at her twice, now watched with open, breathless attention, and Illyra stood at the center of it all, scarred and plain and utterly unprepared, waiting to find out what kind of storm she had just walked into. King Kale did not answer her with words. He knelt. The sound that swept through the hall in that instant was unlike anything Illyra had ever heard, a collective gasp so loud and so sudden that it seemed to shake the very banners hanging from the ceiling. Nobles who had stood composed and silent moments before now broke into open exclamations, hands flying to mouths, chairs scraping, as people leaned forward to be certain of what they were seeing. Somewhere behind her, Illyra heard her mother make a small, strangled sound, though whether it was horror or disbelief she could not tell. Illyra herself could not move at all. She knew, distantly, the way one knows facts learned long ago and rarely thought of, that among wolves, a king knelt for no one. Kneeling was not a gesture of courtesy in her world. It was the single highest honor a wolf could offer another, reserved for exactly one purpose, spoken of in old stories and older songs, and never, not once in living memory, performed in public by a reigning alpha. It was the gesture given only to a fated mate, the one bond among wolves that could not be chosen, could not be forced, and could not be denied once it was found. "No," she whispered, before she could stop herself. "This is a mistake." "It is not," King Kale said, still kneeling before her, his voice steady, despite the storm of noise rising around them both. "I have waited a very long time for this moment, Illyra, longer than you know. I did not expect to find it today. I did not expect to find it in this hall, among 100 women dressed to be seen. But I know what I feel, and I will not pretend otherwise for the comfort of anyone in this room." Illyra's mind raced through every possible explanation that was not the one standing directly in front of her. A cruel joke arranged by nobles who resented her family. A test of some kind, meant to humiliate her further before the true offering was made. Anything at all, seemed more believable than the plain truth kneeling before her in front of 1,000 witnesses. "You do not know me," she said, quieter now, aware of how many ears were straining to catch every word. "You looked at me for a moment, that is all. People do not choose a mate because of a moment." "I did not choose this," he said simply. "That is precisely the point. A fated bond is not chosen. It is recognized. I recognized you the instant you stepped into this hall, and nothing about your face, your scars, or your family's opinion of you has changed what my wolf already knew before I did." The word scars landed in the silent hall like a stone dropped into still water, and Alira felt heat rush into her face, humiliation and disbelief tangled together so tightly she could not separate them. She had spent her whole life being defined by that single mark, treated as though it made her less deserving of kindness, less deserving of being seen at all. And now here was a king, kneeling before 1,000 nobles, naming it aloud as though it meant nothing to him whatsoever. Somewhere behind her, a voice rose above the murmuring crowd, sharp with panic thinly disguised as concern. Her mother, Vesa, stepped forward from the line of watching families, her composure cracking at the edges. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice pitched to carry, "forgive me, but surely there has been some confusion. My daughter Alira was only brought as tradition required. Our true offering, our daughter Naira, stands just there, prepared and eager to." "I did not ask for your opinion," King Kale said, and though his voice did not rise, the sheer weight behind it silenced Vesa instantly, more effectively than any shout could have managed. He rose to his feet then, slowly, his eyes never once leaving Alira's face, and turned enough to address the hall without releasing her from his attention entirely. "I have found my mate. I will not be asking twice, and I will not be entertaining objections from those who clearly failed to recognize her worth long before I did." The words struck something loose in Alira's chest, something she had kept bound tightly for 17 years. No one had ever spoken about her worth in front of her family before, let alone spoken about it as though it were an obvious, undeniable fact rather than a question still being decided. She did not know what to do with the feeling rising in her throat, hot and unfamiliar, somewhere between disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. "I do not understand why," she said again, softer this time, meant only for him, though the silence of the hall carried it regardless. "Look at me. Truly look. There are 100 women in this hall more suited to stand beside you than I am." King Kale stepped closer, close enough that the rest of the hall blurred into little more than distant shapes and murmuring sound. "I am looking," he said. "I have not stopped looking since you walked through those doors. I see a woman who stood in a room built to make her feel small and refused to shrink. I see courage that 100 unscarred faces in this hall could not begin to match. Whatever your family taught you to believe about your own worth, they were wrong, and I intend to spend as long as it takes proving it to you." For a moment, Alira could not speak at all. She was aware of her father's stunned silence somewhere behind her, aware of Naira's furious, humiliated stillness among the other offered women, aware of 1,000 nobles watching a scene none of them would ever forget for as long as they lived. But mostly she was aware of the king standing before her, steady and certain, in a way that nothing in her life had ever been, offering her something she had never once let herself imagine wanting. "I cannot promise I will make this easy for you," she finally said, because it was the only honest thing she had left to offer. "I do not know how to believe this is real." "Then I will simply have to be patient," King Kale said, and for the first time since she had entered the hall, something in his cold, composed expression softened into the faintest suggestion of a smile. "I have waited centuries for you without knowing it. I can wait a little longer for you to believe it." He offered his hand, and Alira stared at it for a long moment, before finally, hesitantly, placing her own within it. His grip was warm and careful, as though he understood without being told that she had spent her life flinching away from touch that never came gently. The moment their palms met, a strange current passed through her, not painful, but startling in its intensity, a recognition that settled somewhere deep beneath thought, in the part of her that was wolf rather than woman. The steward, still visibly shaken, finally found his voice enough to address the hall. "By the ancient right of the fated bond," he announced, though his tone wavered with uncertainty at the sheer novelty of the moment. "King Kale has claimed his mate. The offering ceremony is concluded." The hall erupted into noise the instant the words left his mouth, a tangled wave of astonished murmuring, scattered applause from nobles eager to be seen approving of whatever the king decided. And beneath it all, the unmistakable sound of dozens of disappointed women trying to mask their humiliation with practiced grace. Elira barely registered any of it. She was still staring at her hand held within the king's, still waiting for the moment when this would reveal itself to be some elaborate misunderstanding. It did not come. King Kale led her away from the dais, past the rows of offered women, past nobles who bowed low as they passed, past her own family standing frozen at the edge of the hall. She caught her father's expression as she passed, unreadable and pale, and her mother's, twisted somewhere between fury and desperate recalculation, already searching for some way to salvage advantage from a situation that had slipped entirely out of her control. Naira did not look at her at all. Her younger sister stared fixedly at the floor, jaw tight, hands clenched in the fabric of her sapphire gown. They were given a private chamber off the main hall, away from the noise and the staring eyes, though Elira could still hear the muffled roar of conversation through the heavy wooden door. The room was smaller than she expected for a king's private quarters, warmer too, lit by a low fire rather than the cold grandeur of the hall outside. King Kale released her hand once the door closed behind them, giving her space in a way that felt deliberate, as though he sensed exactly how overwhelmed she was, and refused to add his own closeness to that weight. "You do not have to speak," he said quietly, watching her from a respectful distance. "I know this is a great deal to absorb in a single evening." Elira sank onto the edge of a stone bench near the fire, her legs finally giving in to the tremor they had been fighting since the moment he first knelt. "A great deal," she repeated faintly, almost laughing at how small the words felt against what had just happened. "I came here expecting to be sent home before the hour was finished. My family made certain I understood that much before we ever left our territory." Something dark passed behind King Kale's eyes at that, gone as quickly as it appeared, though Elira noticed it all the same. "Your family," he said carefully, "will learn very quickly that whatever opinion they held of you no longer holds any weight within these walls." "You do not know them," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, only exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying something heavy for so long it had become simply part of how she moved through the world. "They will smile at you tomorrow and tell you how proud they are, and they will mean none of it. They have never meant anything kind, they said to me." King Kale crossed the room and knelt again, though this time it was not the formal ceremonial gesture that had shaken the entire hall, but something quieter, more personal, bringing himself level with her rather than standing above her. "Then I am glad," he said, "that their opinion of you will no longer decide anything about your life. You are safe here, Elira. Whatever you were before you walked into that hall, you are something else now, and I intend to make certain everyone within these walls understands that, starting tonight." She studied his face in the firelight, searching, as she always searched, for the crack that would reveal the trick hidden beneath kindness. She had been disappointed too many times to trust easily, and some old, wary part of her expected disappointment here too, expected that this warmth would curdle the moment it grew inconvenient. But there was nothing in his expression that matched the coldness she had heard described in every rumor about him, nothing that matched the brutal, unfeeling king, whose name made grown wolves lower their voices. There was only quiet, steady attention, fixed entirely on her. "I do not know how to trust this," she admitted finally, the words costing her more than she expected them to. "I do not know how to trust you." "Then do not trust it yet," King Kale said simply. "Trust is not something I expect from you tonight, or tomorrow, or even next month. I only ask that you allow me the chance to earn it, in whatever time it takes. That is all I am asking, Elira, nothing more." Outside the chamber door, the noise of the hall had begun to quiet, nobles filing out into the night to carry word of what they had witnessed to every corner of the king's territory before morning. Elira knew, even sitting in the warmth of that firelit room, that the story of tonight would spread far beyond these walls by sunrise, that her scarred face and her family's careless cruelty would soon be common knowledge across 5 territories. She knew, too, that not everyone hearing that story would greet it with the same quiet steadiness the king had shown her. Somewhere in that vast stronghold, among the dozens of women who had been passed over that night, resentment was already beginning to take root. And somewhere beyond the walls, In a manor 2 days' ride south, her family was already beginning to calculate how best to use this unexpected turn to their advantage. Elira did not know any of that yet. She only knew that for the first time in 17 years, someone had knelt before her instead of looking away, and whatever came next, she intended to face it with her chin lifted, exactly as he had asked her to. Morning came with a knock that startled her out of a thin, uneasy sleep. She had been given a chamber of her own for the night, grander than anything she had ever slept in before, with tall windows overlooking a courtyard of dark stone and a bed large enough for 4 people. She had barely used any of it, curling instead near the edge of the mattress out of old habit, the way she had always slept in her family's house, careful never to take up more space than she was permitted. The knock came again, softer this time, and a voice followed it, warm and unfamiliar. "Lady Elira? The king asked me to see that you had everything you needed this morning." Elira opened the door to find a young woman waiting in the corridor, dressed in the simple uniform of palace staff, her expression open and curious, in a way that felt almost strange, after a lifetime of guarded looks from her own family's servants. "My name is Wren," the woman said, offering a small, easy smile. "I have been asked to attend you for as long as you wish it. There is breakfast waiting, if you are hungry, and the king requested that I bring you to the East Garden, once you are ready. He said there is no hurry." Elira studied her for a moment, waiting for the flicker of discomfort she had grown used to seeing whenever someone's eyes landed on her scar. It did not come. Wren's gaze remained steady, friendly, entirely unbothered, and something in Elira's chest loosened just slightly at the absence of that familiar wince. "Thank you," Elira said, and meant it more than the simple words could carry. The East Garden turned out to be a wide, sheltered courtyard, tucked behind the stronghold's main tower, filled with hardy northern flowers that had no business blooming in such a cold climate, and yet did so anyway, defiant splashes of color against gray stone. King Kale was already there when she arrived, standing near a low stone wall overlooking a distant tree line, and something in the set of his shoulders eased visibly the moment he saw her. "You slept," he said, though it was phrased more as a question than a statement. "A little," Elira admitted. "It is a great deal to grow used to." "I imagine so." He gestured toward a bench beneath a leafless tree, and she sat, grateful for the quiet after the noise and spectacle of the night before. He remained standing, though he kept a respectful distance, as though he had decided overnight that patience would be the only currency he offered her from now on. "I want to explain something to you, if you will allow it, about what happened last night, and what it means going forward." Elira nodded, and he began to speak, his voice low and careful, choosing each word the way a man chooses his footing on uncertain ground. "Among wolves, most matches are chosen," he said. "Families arrange them, ambitions arrange them, sometimes simple affection arranges them, and there is nothing wrong in any of that. But every few generations, something different happens. A wolf meets another, and recognizes them, not through choice or reasoning, but through instinct, older than either of them. We call it a fated bond. It cannot be forced, and it cannot be faked. I have heard stories of it my whole life. I did not expect to experience it myself, and certainly not in the middle of a ceremony built for an entirely different purpose." "And you are certain," Elira said carefully, "that what happened last night was that, not simply surprise, or curiosity, or something else entirely?" "I am certain," he said, "and there was no hesitation in it at all. My wolf recognized yours the instant you stepped into that hall. It is not something I can adequately describe to someone who has not felt it, but I promise you, Elira, there was no mistake in it. I have led armies. I have made decisions that cost lives, and decisions that saved them. I know the difference between uncertainty and conviction, and there was no uncertainty in me last night." She turned the words over slowly, still searching, still wary, though the wariness had begun to feel less like protection, and more like habit, clinging on past its usefulness. "My family will not accept this easily," she said. "Not because they care whether I am happy, but because it upsets whatever plans they had built around Naira." "Your family," King Kale said, and something hardened briefly in his voice, "will accept whatever terms I set, or they will find themselves with far fewer privileges than they currently enjoy. I do not say that to be cruel. I say it because I have already seen enough of how they treated you, to know they do not deserve gentle handling." A council bell rang somewhere within the stronghold, distant but unmistakable, and King Kale's expression shifted, the softness of the morning folding back into the composed authority Alira had first seen him wear on his throne. "I am afraid duty calls sooner than I would like," he said. "My council will want to discuss last night at length, and I expect not all of them will be pleased by what they hear. Will you be comfortable remaining here for a few hours? Ren will see to anything you need." "I will manage," Alira said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. The council chamber, when King Kale entered it a short while later, was already tense with the particular quiet of men and women, choosing their words carefully, before a king they did not wish to anger. 6 advisors sat around the long table, representatives of the territories he had unified through years of hard-won conquest, and every one of them turned to look at him the moment he entered. "Your Majesty," said the eldest among them, a broad-shouldered man named Bastian, whose loyalty to the crown had never once been in question, though his caution occasionally bordered on stubbornness. "We must discuss last night." "Discuss it then," King Kale said, taking his seat at the head of the table without ceremony. "The woman you have claimed," Bastian continued carefully, "comes from House Varn, a minor noble house with little influence, and, forgive my bluntness, a daughter, openly scarred, and previously considered unmarriageable by her own family's admission. There will be talk, Your Majesty. Among the territories, among rival packs who have long sought reasons to question the strength of your rule." "Let them talk," King Kale said evenly. "I did not ask this council's opinion on the matter of my mate. I informed you of it as a courtesy, not as a request for permission." A younger advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Ophira who represented the Eastern Territories, leaned forward with the careful diplomacy of someone used to navigating dangerous conversations. "No one questions your right to choose, Your Majesty. What concerns this council is stability. Several rival packs have grown restless under your rule these past years, testing borders, questioning succession. A fated bond is undeniable to those who understand its weight, but not every wolf beyond these walls will understand it, or care to. Some will see only a scarred, low-ranking bride, and assume weakness where none exists. Then this council's task," King Kale said, "is to ensure they understand the truth of it quickly, before assumption becomes dangerous. I did not build 5 territories into one kingdom by allowing fear of gossip to dictate my decisions, and I do not intend to start now." The conversation continued for the better part of an hour, circling questions of security, of how the news would be delivered to distant territories, of what protections would need to be placed around Alira, now that her position had changed so drastically overnight. King Kale answered every question with the same unshaken calm, though beneath it, a current of protectiveness ran clear enough that even Bastian eventually stopped pressing the matter of suitability and moved instead toward the practical matter of safety. "There is one more thing, Your Majesty," Ophira said, as the meeting drew toward its close, her voice dropping slightly. "Word has already reached us that several of the offered women passed over last night, left the stronghold this morning, deeply displeased. One in particular, Lady Sable of the Western Coastal Pack, was overheard making comments that bordered on threats before she departed. I do not say this to alarm you unnecessarily, only to note that resentment tends to seek an outlet, and Lady Alira may find herself its target if we are not careful." King Kale's jaw tightened at that, though his voice remained level. "Then we will be careful," he said. "See that additional guards are assigned near her chambers, quietly, without alarming her unnecessarily. I will not have her spend her first weeks here looking over her shoulder, because a spurned noblewoman cannot accept the outcome of a ceremony she attended by choice." Meanwhile, in the East Garden, Alira sat beneath the leafless tree, long after King Kale had gone, watching Ren move between the flower beds with easy familiarity, humming something under her breath that Alira did not recognize but found oddly comforting all the same. "You do not seem bothered by my face," Alira said eventually, the question slipping out before she had fully decided to ask it. Ren glanced up, surprised, then thoughtful. "Should I be?" she asked, not unkindly. "A scar is only a story written on skin. It does not tell me anything about who you are underneath it, and I have found, over the years, that the people most bothered by scars are usually the ones who have never survived anything worth surviving." Alira did not have an answer for that, not immediately, but she found herself turning the words over long after Ren had moved on to trimming a stubborn hedge, holding them close the way one holds something rare and unexpectedly kind. By the time King Kale returned from the council chamber, the sun had shifted well past its highest point, and Alira had begun, cautiously, to feel something almost like ease settle into her shoulders. It did not last. A servant arrived moments later, breathless and pale, bearing a message that had just arrived by messenger hawk from House Varn, requesting an audience with the king at his earliest convenience regarding, the message claimed, matters of the utmost importance concerning his newly claimed mate. Alira felt the ease drain out of her instantly, replaced by the old, familiar tightness she had carried her entire life, whenever her family's intentions turned toward her. Whatever her mother and father wanted now, she knew with grim certainty, it would not be born of concern for her happiness. It never had been before, and she doubted very much that a king's throne would be enough to change that now. King Kale found her still seated in the garden when he returned, and one look at her face told him the message had already reached her. "You do not have to be present," he said gently, sitting beside her for the first time since they had met, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, without either of them acknowledging it directly. "I can meet with your family alone, if that is what you prefer." "No," Alira said, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. "I would rather be there. I have spent my whole life letting them speak about me in rooms I was not permitted to enter. I do not intend to start that pattern again now." Something like pride flickered across King Kale's face at that, quick and warm. "Then we will meet them together," he said, "and you will say whatever you wish to say. I will not silence you in your own audience, Alira. Not now, not ever." Her family arrived at the stronghold by mid-afternoon, moving with far more haste than the 2-day journey should reasonably have allowed, which told Alira plainly enough how quickly word of last night's events had spread, and how desperately her parents intended to secure their place within it, before anyone else could. They were shown into a smaller receiving hall, more intimate than the grand chamber of the ceremony, but no less formal, its walls lined with tall windows that let in the pale afternoon light. Garen entered first, his expression carefully arranged into something that might have passed for warmth to a stranger, but which Alira recognized instantly as calculation. Vesa followed close behind, already dressed in finer clothing than she had worn the previous night, as though she had anticipated needing to look the part of a king's mother-in-law on short notice. Nyra trailed last, her face pale and tight, clearly still nursing the wound of the previous evening's humiliation, though she had schooled her expression into something more neutral than the raw fury Alira had glimpsed in the hall. "Your Majesty," Garen said, bowing low, "we came as quickly as we could, eager to offer our congratulations and our full support, in whatever way might serve you and our daughter best." "How thoughtful," King Kale said, his tone pleasant enough on the surface, though Alira had already learned to hear the edge beneath it. "Please, sit." They sat, and for a long, uncomfortable moment, no one spoke. Alira remained standing beside the king's chair, rather than taking a seat of her own, unwilling to place herself lower than her family, in a room where, for the first time, the power balance had shifted entirely in her favor. "We wish to discuss," Vesa began carefully, "the matter of Alira's dowry, and of course the arrangements befitting her new position. It would reflect poorly on House Varn if our daughter arrived at the palace with nothing befitting a king's mate, and we would be honored to provide whatever is necessary to see her properly established here." Alira almost laughed at the audacity of it. 17 years of neglect, and now, faced with the sudden reversal of her fortune, her mother's first instinct was to find a way to attach House Varn's name to it, to claim credit for a match they had actively tried to avoid. "That will not be necessary," King Kale said, before Alira could respond herself. "Alira requires nothing from House Varn. She has everything she needs here, and will continue to have everything she needs, regardless of what her family chooses to offer or withhold." Vesa's composure flickered, just slightly, before she recovered it.
"Of course, Your Majesty. We only wish to be of service. We are, after all, overjoyed at this turn of events. We always believed Alira had a great deal to offer, given the proper circumstances."
"Did you?" Alira said quietly, the first words she had spoken since her family entered the room, and every eye turned toward her at once. "I do not recall you ever saying so before last night." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Garen shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, while Vesa's mouth pressed into a thin line, searching for some graceful way to navigate a conversation that had suddenly turned far more dangerous than she had anticipated. Naira, for her part, said nothing at all, staring fixedly at a point somewhere on the floor. "Elira," Vesa said finally, her voice taking on the wounded, aggrieved tone she had always used whenever her authority was questioned. "You must understand, we only ever wanted what was best for this family. Every decision we made regarding your upbringing was made with careful consideration for Naira," Elira finished quietly. "Every decision was made for Naira. I understand that quite well, Mother. I have understood it since I was 6 years old, lying in a healer's bed while you sat beside my sister's minor burns, and never once came to check on mine." Vesa's face went pale, and beside her, Garen shifted uncomfortably, clearly unwilling to defend a moment even he could not fully justify. King Kale's expression had gone hard and still, his eyes fixed on Vesa with an intensity that made the woman visibly shrink in her seat. "Is this true?" he asked, and though his voice remained level, there was no mistaking the danger threading through it. "It was a chaotic night, Your Majesty," Vesa stammered. "Choices had to be made quickly, and—" "You chose," King Kale said, cutting her off with a coldness Elira had not heard from him before that moment. "To leave a 6-year-old child alone, in a burning building, while you saved her sister first. And in the 17 years since, you have never once acknowledged that choice, or its consequences, to the daughter who survived it despite you." No one in the room offered an answer to that, because there was no answer that would not condemn them further. Elira watched her parents sit in stunned, guilty silence, and felt something unexpected settle into her chest. Not quite triumph, not quite relief, but something adjacent to both. The strange, quiet satisfaction of watching a truth she had carried alone for so long, finally spoken aloud in front of the people who had caused it. "I believe this audience is concluded," King Kale said, rising from his seat. "House Varn will receive no additional privileges, no dowry claims, and no further influence over matters concerning Elira. She belongs to herself now, and to me, and to no one else's ambitions. You may return home." Garen rose immediately, eager to escape the room before matters worsened further, pulling a stiff, silent Vesa up beside him. Naira lingered a moment longer, her gaze finally lifting to meet Elira's, and for one brief instant, something almost like an apology flickered across her face, before she smothered it and followed their parents out the door. The room fell quiet once they had gone, and Elira found herself trembling slightly, the adrenaline of the confrontation draining away and leaving something rawer and more fragile in its place. King Kale turned to her immediately, concern replacing the hardness that had been in his expression only moments before. "Are you well?" he asked quietly. "I do not know," Elira admitted. "I have wanted to say those words to them for 17 years. I did not expect it to feel like this, saying them at last." "It rarely feels the way we expect," he said gently. "Grief and relief often arrive together, tangled up in ways that are difficult to separate." She nodded, grateful he understood without requiring further explanation, and allowed herself, for the first time since arriving at the stronghold, to lean slightly into his presence rather than away from it. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but King Kale went very still at the shift, as though unwilling to disturb a moment he had not dared hope for so soon. Neither of them noticed, in that quiet aftermath, the figure watching from the far end of the corridor outside the receiving hall. Lady Sable, the noblewoman who had been passed over the previous night, and who had not yet left the stronghold as instructed, stood just beyond the doorway, arms folded, expression carved from equal parts humiliation and calculation. She had heard enough of the confrontation to understand exactly how deep the scarred girl's insecurities ran, and exactly how fiercely the king now intended to protect her. That fierceness, Sable decided as she turned and walked quietly away down the corridor, would make an excellent weapon, if wielded correctly. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Elira had never known before. Quiet mornings in the East Garden, careful lessons in the customs and expectations of court life delivered patiently by Wren, and evenings spent in King Kale's company that grew, slowly, from cautious silence into something approaching ease. He never pushed her. He never demanded more closeness than she offered freely, and that restraint, more than any grand gesture could have, began to wear away at the wariness she had carried into the stronghold like armor. Still, doubt lingered, stubborn and quiet, in the corners of her mind. She woke some morning certain the entire arrangement would dissolve before breakfast, that King Kale would arrive at her door with an apologetic explanation, some council decision or political necessity that required him to reconsider his choice. It never happened, but the fear did not leave simply because it went unfulfilled. 17 years of being told she was unworthy of love had built a foundation that a few weeks of kindness could not fully dismantle. "You are doing it again," King Kale said one evening, as they walked together along the stronghold's outer wall, the northern sky bruised purple with the coming night. Waiting for something to go wrong. Alira glanced at him, surprised he had noticed something she thought she hid well. "Is it so obvious?" "Only to someone paying close attention," he said, "which I intend to keep doing, for as long as you will allow it." She managed a small, genuine smile at that, rare enough that it seemed to catch him off guard, his own expression softening in response. "I am trying," she admitted. "It is simply difficult to trust something good when nothing in my life has prepared me to expect it." "Then let me help prepare you," he said simply. "One day at a time, if that is what it takes." It was during one of those quiet evenings that Alira first noticed the whispers following her through the stronghold's corridors, subtle at first, servants falling silent as she passed, nobles exchanging glances she was clearly not meant to see. She mentioned it to Ren one morning while they walked through the garden, and Ren's expression grew careful in a way that told Alira there was more to the story than casual gossip. "There are always whispers when something unexpected happens at court," Ren said, choosing her words with visible caution. "Some of the women who attended the ceremony have not taken the outcome gracefully. Lady Sable in particular has remained in the capital longer than most guests typically stay, and she has not been quiet about her opinions." "What opinions?" Alira asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "That the king's judgment was clouded," Ren said reluctantly. "That a true alpha king should have chosen strength and beauty befitting his throne, not a minor noblewoman with a ruined face and no political value. I do not say this to hurt you, only because I think you deserve to know what is being said, rather than be blindsided by it." Alira absorbed the words with the same practiced stillness she had used her whole life to absorb cruelty, though something in her chest tightened uncomfortably at hearing it confirmed. She had expected resentment. She had not expected it to have a name and a face already circling closer than she realized. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "I would rather know than be surprised." That evening, at a small gathering held in the stronghold's main hall to welcome several visiting nobles from the Eastern Territories, Alira found herself face to face with Lady Sable for the first time since the ceremony. The woman was strikingly beautiful, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, dressed in deep crimson that stood out starkly against the muted colors favored by most of the court. She approached with a smile that did not reach her eyes, dipping into a curtsy just shallow enough to skirt the edge of disrespect without crossing fully into it. "Lady Alira," Sable said, her voice honeyed and cool. "How fortunate you are to have caught the king's attention so completely. Though I confess, even now, I struggle to understand what quality inspired such devotion. Perhaps it is simply a mystery, only His Majesty can explain." "Perhaps," Alira said evenly, refusing to let the barb land visibly, though she felt it all the same. Fate rarely explains itself to satisfy an audience. Something flickered behind Sable's eyes. Irritation quickly smoothed back into pleasant composure. "Of course. How wise of you to say so. I only hope, for your sake, that fate proves as reliable as you seem to believe. Kings, after all, have been known to reconsider their choices when circumstances shift." The threat, thinly veiled beneath courtly pleasantries, was unmistakable, and Alira felt a chill settle beneath her composed exterior, even as she held Sable's gaze steadily. "I will keep that in mind," she said, "though I find I trust King Kale's word, rather more than I trust the opinions of guests who overstayed their welcome." Sable's smile thinned considerably at that, and after a brief, tense pause, she offered another shallow curtsy and withdrew into the crowd, though not before casting one last look toward Alira that carried far more warning than courtesy. King Kale found her shortly after, having watched the exchange from across the hall, with visible tension in his shoulders. "What did she say to you?" he asked quietly, drawing her slightly away from the gathered nobles. "Nothing I cannot manage," Alira said, though her voice betrayed more unease than she intended. "Alira," his tone was gentle but firm, the same tone he used when he wanted her to understand he would not simply let a matter drop. "I would rather know what threatens you than have you carry it alone. That is not a burden I intend to let you shoulder by yourself, not while I am here to share it." She hesitated, then relented, repeating Sable's words as closely as she could remember them. King Kale's jaw tightened as he listened, and by the time she finished, something cold and dangerous had settled into his expression, the same quiet fury she had glimpsed briefly when he learned the truth of her childhood. "She will be asked to leave the stronghold by morning," he said. "I will not have her lingering here to threaten you under the guise of polite conversation." "You do not need to send her away on my account," Illyra said, though part of her, quietly and privately, was grateful he wanted to. "I am not doing it only for your account," he said. "I am doing it because a guest who threatens my mate at a gathering in my own hall has forfeited any right to remain beneath my roof. This is not a punishment born of overprotection, Illyra. It is simply how matters are handled here." Sable did leave the following morning, escorted from the stronghold with cold, formal courtesy that left no doubt as to how thoroughly she had overstepped. But as her carriage rolled away from the black stone walls, disappearing into the tree line beyond the outer gate, she carried with her more than wounded pride. She carried knowledge, gathered carefully over her extended stay, of exactly how deep the new mate's insecurities ran, exactly how protective the king had become, and exactly which weaknesses might be exploited by someone patient enough to wait for the right opportunity. She did not intend to let this humiliation pass without consequence. She simply intended to be far more careful about how that consequence arrived. With Sable gone, the stronghold settled into a calmer rhythm, though Illyra noticed the guards stationed near her chambers had quietly doubled, and Wren's company, once purely companionable, now carried the watchful edge of someone assigned to more than friendship. She did not comment on it. She understood, without needing it explained, that King Kale's protectiveness had only sharpened rather than eased. Weeks passed, and with them came a slow unraveling of the walls Illyra had spent her whole life building. She found herself laughing, genuinely and without restraint, during an evening spent teaching Wren a card game from her childhood, and caught King Kale watching her from across the room, with an expression so openly fond that heat rose in her cheeks long after she looked away. She found herself, more than once, reaching for his hand, without deciding to do it first, some instinct, beneath thought, guiding her toward him, before her mind caught up. It was on one such evening, seated together near the fire in his private study, that King Kale finally asked the question he had been careful not to press before. "Will you tell me about the fire?" he said quietly, watching her face for any sign that the question crossed a line she was not ready to cross. "You do not have to, but I would like to understand, if you are willing to share it." Illyra was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames, feeling the old, familiar tightness rise in her chest at the mere thought of speaking about that night aloud. She had never told the full story to anyone, not even the healers who had treated her burns, not even Wren, who had become as close to a true friend as Illyra had ever known. "I was 6, she began finally, her voice steady, despite the tremor she felt beneath it. "It was late autumn, and a storm had knocked over a lantern in the east wing of our manor. I remember waking to smoke before I understood what was happening. I remember calling for my mother, and hearing her voice somewhere down the hall, calling Odalis's name instead." King Kale said nothing, though his hand found hers, warm and steady, an anchor she had not realized she needed until it was offered. "Odalis was trapped near a fallen beam," Illyra continued, "and she was crying, and frightened, and my mother went to her first. I do not blame her for that, not entirely. Odalis was in more visible danger in that moment. But once Odalis was safe, no one came back for me. I crawled through the smoke on my own, and by the time a servant finally found me, the fire had already done what it did." She touched the scar along her jaw without meaning to, an old, unconscious habit. "I do not know how long I called for help before I stopped believing anyone was coming. I was 6. I do not think I understood, then, that it would become the way my whole life worked afterward." "They never apologized," King Kale said quietly. Not a question but a certainty, born of everything he had already witnessed of her family's behavior. "Never," Illyra confirmed. "My mother told me, years later, that dwelling on old accidents was unbecoming. My father simply never spoke of it at all. I learned, eventually, that asking for acknowledgement only invited further disappointment, so I stopped asking. King Kale's grip on her hand tightened slightly, not painfully, but with a depth of feeling that told her exactly how much restraint it took him not to voice the full weight of his anger at a family who had failed her so completely, so many times over. "You survived that fire alone," he said, "and you have survived every year since, alone, carrying a wound that should have been shared and comforted, rather than mocked and hidden. I cannot undo what was done to you, Alira, but I promise you, for as long as I have breath, you will never again call for help and hear only silence in return." Something in Alira's chest, some knot she had carried so long she had forgotten it was possible to loosen, finally gave way. She did not cry, not exactly, though her eyes burned with the effort of holding back something that had waited 17 years to be released. King Kale did not press her to speak further. He simply held her hand, steady and patient, and let the fire crackle in the silence between them until the worst of the ache had passed. "Thank you," she said eventually, "for asking instead of assuming. No one has ever asked before." "Then I am glad to be the first," he said softly, "and I intend to be the last person you ever need to answer that question for, if that is what you wish." It was, Alira realized as she sat there in the firelight, exactly what she wished, though admitting it, even silently to herself, still felt like stepping onto ground she had not yet learned to trust would hold her weight. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, the ground beneath her felt steady enough to risk it. Outside the study, far beyond the stronghold's walls, a rider moved swiftly through the dark northern forest, carrying a sealed letter toward the western coastal territories, where Lady Sable had returned to nurse her wounded pride. The letter carried no signature, only a careful, deliberate message, describing exactly how deeply the king's mate feared abandonment, exactly how protective he had grown, and exactly how such protectiveness, if properly provoked, might be turned into chaos, capable of shaking a throne 5 territories deep. Sable read the letter twice by candlelight, a slow smile spreading across her face as she folded it closed. She had spent weeks gathering the right pieces. Now, she thought, it was simply a matter of finding the right hands to place them in. Those hands belonged, eventually, to a wolf named Fenwick, a former enforcer from a rival pack who had lost standing under King Kale's expansion years earlier and had carried the grudge ever since like a blade sharpened patiently in the dark. Sable did not need to convince him twice. A wounded king, distracted and destabilized by grief or fear for his newly claimed mate, would be an opportunity too valuable for a man like Fenwick to ignore, especially with the coin Sable offered to guarantee his cooperation. The plan was simple enough in its cruelty. Fenwick would not attack the king directly, not yet, not when the throne remained so heavily guarded. He would attack the one vulnerability King Kale had never possessed before now, the one soft place a man so carefully armored had only just allowed the world to see. He would attack Alira. Fenwick arrived at the stronghold 3 weeks later, disguised among a rotation of new kitchen staff, brought in ahead of a planned harvest feast, his credentials forged carefully enough to pass the palace's usual scrutiny. He was patient. He watched, over the following days, learning Alira's routines, the hours she spent in the garden, the paths she walked between her chambers, and the small library she had begun to favor, the moments when her guards, however watchful, allowed a few feet of distance out of respect for her privacy. Alira, for her part, remained largely unaware of the danger circling closer with each passing day. She had grown comfortable in the stronghold in ways she had never imagined possible when she first arrived. Comfortable enough that the guards trailing her felt more like habit than necessity. Comfortable enough that she had begun, cautiously, to let her guard down in ways she had never once permitted at her family's estate. The attack came on a quiet afternoon, while she walked alone through the library's outer garden, a small enclosed space tucked between high stone walls where she often went to read undisturbed. She heard the footsteps too late, quick and deliberate, and turned, just as a figure emerged from the shadow of a stone archway, blade already drawn. Instinct, older and sharper than fear, took over before conscious thought could catch up. Alira had grown up in a house that offered her no protection, and though her family had never trained her formally in combat, the years of learning to dodge cruelty, to read danger in the shift of a shoulder or the tightening of a jaw, had sharpened reflexes she did not fully know she possessed until this exact moment. She threw herself sideways as the blade came down, feeling the wind of its passage rather than its edge, and rolled hard against the garden's stone border, scrambling upright with her heart hammering violently against her ribs. Fenwick advanced again, faster this time, and Alira grabbed the nearest heavy object within reach, a stone garden urn, and swung it with every ounce of strength fear could summon. It connected with his shoulder hard enough to stagger him, buying her precious seconds she used to scream, loud and sharp, a sound that tore through the quiet garden and carried, thankfully, far enough to reach the guards stationed near the library entrance. Fenwick lunged again, more desperate now that the element of surprise had failed him, and Alira twisted away, feeling the blade catch the edge of her sleeve, close enough that a thin line of heat bloomed along her forearm. She did not have time to feel the pain. The garden door burst open, guards flooding in with weapons already drawn, and Fenwick, recognizing the odds had shifted irrecoverably against him, turned to flee toward the outer wall rather than risk capture. He did not make it far. The guards, trained and swift, brought him down before he cleared the garden's second archway, pinning him to the stone with brutal efficiency. Alira sank against the garden wall, her legs finally giving out beneath the flood of adrenaline draining from her system, her forearm throbbing where the blade had grazed it. It was Ren who reached her first, dropping to her knees beside her with a horrified expression, pressing a scarf hastily against the wound to slow the bleeding. "You are safe," Ren said, over and over, as much to steady herself as to comfort Alira. "You are safe now. Someone, fetch the king, quickly." King Kale arrived within minutes, having been alerted the instant the alarm sounded through the stronghold, and the sight that greeted him, Alira pale and shaking against the garden wall, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage on her arm, seemed to strip every ounce of composure from his face at once. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and dropped to his knees beside her, hands hovering as though afraid to touch her too roughly, as though she might shatter under contact. "I am well," Alira said quickly, seeing the raw panic in his eyes and wanting, more than anything, to ease it. "It is only a shallow cut. I am well, Kale." It was the first time she had used his name without the title attached, and something in his expression cracked open at the sound of it. Relief and fury tangled together so tightly, he seemed unable to separate them. "Who?" he said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way she had not heard before, turning toward the guards restraining Fenwick against the garden wall. "Who sent you?" Fenwick, bloodied and pinned, said nothing at first, jaw set with the stubborn defiance of a man who had already accepted he would not survive the day, regardless of what he confessed. But King Kale rose slowly, releasing Alira's hand only long enough to cross the garden, and whatever expression crossed his face as he approached was enough to loosen even Fenwick's resolve. "Lady Sable," Fenwick finally admitted, voice rough with pain and resignation. "She paid well. She said the king's grief would make him careless, and careless kings lose their thrones." King Kale's expression went colder than Alira had ever seen it, a stillness far more dangerous than any shout could have been. He said nothing further to Fenwick, simply turned back to the guards and gave a single, quiet order to have him secured for formal judgment, before returning immediately to Alira's side and gathering her carefully into his arms. "I have you," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with an emotion he did not bother trying to hide. "I have you, and I am not letting anything come near you again." Alira allowed herself, for the first time since the attack began, to simply lean into him fully, letting the last of the adrenaline drain out of her body in his arms. "I fought back," she said quietly, almost disbelieving of her own words as she spoke them. "I did not think I knew how, but I fought back." "You survived," King Kale said, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes, something fierce and proud, burning behind his own. "You have been surviving your entire life, Alira. Today was simply the first time anyone gave you the chance to prove it to yourself." The healers arrived shortly after to tend the shallow wound on her arm, and though the cut required only a handful of careful stitches, King Kale did not leave her side for a single moment of the treatment. His hand wrapped around hers the entire time, as though letting go might undo the fragile relief of knowing she was safe. Word of the attack spread through the stronghold within the hour, and by nightfall, King Kale had already dispatched riders toward the western coastal territories to secure Lady Sable's arrest, his fury tempered only by the discipline of a ruler, who understood that justice, however deserved, needed to be carried out properly, rather than in the heat of unchecked rage. Elira, resting in her chambers that evening with her arm carefully bandaged, found herself studying the thin line of stitches with something unexpected mixed into her exhaustion, a quiet thread of pride she had never once been permitted to feel about herself before. She had been attacked, frightened, and hurt, and yet she had not simply survived. She had fought. She had mattered enough, for the first time in her life, for someone to come running the instant she screamed, and she had mattered enough to herself, in that terrifying moment, to refuse to go down without resistance. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the wide scope of everything that had happened since she walked into that great hall weeks ago, but to a woman who had spent 17 years believing herself invisible and unworthy of protection, it was the first true proof that both beliefs had always been lies. Lady Sable was captured 8 days later, discovered attempting to cross into a neutral southern territory, under a borrowed name. She was returned to the stronghold in chains, her composure finally cracking under the weight of what she now faced, and King Kale presided over her judgment himself, seated on the same black stone throne where he had first knelt before Elira weeks earlier. The council chamber was full for the trial. Nobles from every territory gathered to witness a case that had already become the talk of the entire kingdom. Elira attended as well, standing beside the throne rather than seated among the observers, a position she had not fully understood the significance of until Wren quietly explained that only a king's mate stood at his side during matters of formal judgment. Sable did not deny her involvement once the evidence against her was laid plain: the letters recovered from Fenwick's belongings, the testimony of servants who had seen her lingering near the kitchens during her supposed departure, the coin traced back through careful investigation to accounts bearing her family's seal. She simply stood, pale and defiant, and offered no apology, only bitter justification. "I did what any wolf of true standing would have done," she said, her voice carrying through the silent chamber. "You humiliated me in front of the entire court, Your Majesty, choosing a scarred nobody over women of genuine worth. I merely sought to correct an imbalance that should never have existed." "You sought to murder an innocent woman," King Kale said, his voice flat and cold, "because your pride could not accept a truth larger than your own ambition. There is no correction in that, Lady Sable. There is only cruelty, dressed up in the language of entitlement." The judgment was swift and severe, stripping Sable of her noble standing and exiling her permanently from the kingdom's territories, a punishment that carried its own particular weight among wolves who valued pack and belonging above almost everything else. As the guards led her from the chamber, she cast one final look toward Elira, venomous and unrepentant, though Elira found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the look no longer carried the power to frighten her the way it once might have. "You survived her too," King Kale murmured, once the chamber had emptied, and only the two of them remained near the throne. "In every way that mattered." Elira nodded slowly, watching the last of the nobles file out through the great doors, feeling something settle in her chest that felt remarkably like peace. "I think," she said, "I am finally beginning to believe that I deserve to be here." "You have always deserved it," King Kale said gently. "It only took the world catching up to what I saw the moment you walked through those doors." Peace, however, proved fragile, in a court still adjusting to the sudden elevation of an unexpected mate, and it was not long before House Varn resurfaced, this time with far more elaborate ambitions than a simple audience could satisfy. Word reached the stronghold that Garin and Vesa had begun quietly cultivating alliances among lesser nobles sympathetic to their cause, positioning themselves not as apologetic parents seeking reconciliation, but as a family determined to claim a share of the influence their daughter's unexpected rise had made possible. They arrived at the stronghold uninvited nearly 2 months after the trial, this time bearing gifts, elaborate and costly, clearly intended to soften whatever resistance they anticipated meeting. Elira received them in the same receiving hall as before, though this time she chose to sit rather than stand, a small but deliberate shift in the balance of power that did not go unnoticed by her mother's sharp, calculating eyes. "Elira, my dear," Vesa began, her voice honeyed in a way that grated against every memory Elira carried of genuine warmth, withheld for 17 years. "We have come to make amends properly this time. We understand now how deeply we failed you, and we wish only to rebuild what was broken between us." "You understand," Elira repeated evenly, "because I am now a king's mate. and rebuilding this relationship has suddenly become useful to you. Vessa's composed expression faltered, just slightly, before she recovered it with practiced ease. That is not fair, Alira. Families make mistakes. We are here because we love you, and we wish to move forward. You are here, Alira said, because Odalise has recently pursued a match with a lesser noble house, struggling to maintain its standing, and you require influence you do not currently possess to secure it favorably. You are here because Naira remains unmarried, and increasingly desperate for a match worthy of the ambitions you instilled in her since childhood. And you are here because House Varn's reputation, quietly damaged by rumors of neglect and favoritism, requires the polish that association with a king's court might provide. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel physical. Garin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unwilling to contradict truths he could not honestly deny, while Vessa's face went through a rapid series of expressions before settling, finally, into something closer to genuine desperation than practiced charm. Perhaps our reasons are not purely selfless, Vessa admitted quietly, the admission clearly costing her a great deal of pride. But does that erase 17 years entirely? Are we to be given no chance at all to prove we can be better? Alira studied her mother for a long moment, weighing the question with more care than her family likely expected of her. She was no longer the frightened, invisible girl who had crawled through smoke alone, and she was no longer the quiet, overlooked woman who had stood at the end of a line waiting to be dismissed. She had survived fire, survived neglect, survived an assassin's blade, and she had done it all, while carrying scars that her own family once told her made her unworthy of love. "I do not hate you," she said finally, and meant it, though the words carried more weariness than warmth. "Hatred requires more energy than I am willing to spend on people who caused me so much pain for so little reason. But I will not pretend the last 17 years did not happen, simply because it is convenient for you, now that I hold a position you can benefit from. If you wish a relationship with me going forward, it will be built slowly, and it will be built honestly, with no expectation of privilege or influence attached to it. That is the only offer I am prepared to make." Vessa's eyes glistened, whether from genuine emotion or wounded pride. Alira could not be entirely certain, and perhaps, she realized, it no longer mattered which it was. "That is more than we deserve," Vessa said quietly. "But we accept it, and we are grateful." Garin nodded beside her, silent but sincere in a way that felt, for the first time in Alira's memory, genuinely humbled rather than merely strategic. They left the stronghold that afternoon without the influence they had hoped to secure, but with something else instead. A fragile, uncertain foundation upon which an honest relationship might eventually, carefully, be built. King Kale, who had remained quiet throughout the entire exchange, watching from beside the hearth with visible pride in the way Alira handled a confrontation she once would have fled from entirely, waited until the doors closed behind her family before speaking. "You handled that with more grace than I would have managed," he said softly. "I am not certain I could have offered them anything at all, after everything they did to you." "I did not do it for them," Alira admitted, sinking into the chair beside his own, suddenly aware of how much energy the confrontation had cost her. "I did it for myself. I did not want to carry their cruelty as a weight in my chest for the rest of my life. Forgiveness, even a small, careful kind, felt lighter than hatred." "You continue to surprise me," King Kale said, reaching over to take her hand. "Every single day." "Good," Alira said, allowing herself a small, tired smile. "I intend to keep doing so, for as long as you will let me." "Forever," he said simply, "if you will allow it." Winter settled over the northern territories in the months that followed, blanketing the stronghold in pale snow, and turning the East Garden into a quiet, frozen landscape that Alira had come to love almost as much as its summer blooms. She had grown, in the time since the ceremony that changed her life, into someone she barely recognized when she caught her reflection now, not because her scar had faded, for it never would, but because the woman looking back at her no longer flinched from what she saw. She spent her mornings with Ren, who had become as close as family, and her afternoons increasingly involved in matters of the court itself, sitting in on council meetings at King Kale's invitation, offering perspectives shaped by a life spent watching from the margins that the seasoned advisors, for all their experience, had never considered before. Bastian, once skeptical of her suitability, had become one of her most vocal supporters, impressed by an insight into overlooked concerns that came, Illyra suspected, precisely because she had spent so many years being overlooked herself. Still, whispers persisted in corners of the kingdom beyond the stronghold's walls, particularly among territories that had not yet had the opportunity to see for themselves the woman King Kale had chosen. Some dismissed the fated bond as mere sentiment, unlikely to withstand the practical demands of ruling 5 territories. Others, more dangerous in their skepticism, began to question whether a scarred, low-ranking noblewoman possessed the strength necessary to stand as queen beside a king whose reign depended on the perception of unshakable power. King Kale, aware of these murmurs, approached Illyra one evening in early winter with a proposal that made her stomach tighten with old, familiar anxiety, even as her heart recognized the necessity of it. "There is to be a gathering," he said carefully, "in the new year. Representatives from all 5 territories, along with several neighboring kingdoms who have grown curious, perhaps concerned, about the stability of our union. It will be the largest formal court since the ceremony itself. I would understand if you wish to remain apart from it, but I believe, if you are willing, this could be the moment the doubts finally settle." Illyra considered the proposal for a long moment, memory flooding back unbidden to that first terrible night, standing exposed before 1,000 strangers in a plain gray dress, waiting to be dismissed. The thought of facing another such gathering, larger and more consequential than the first, sent a familiar tremor of fear through her chest. But she was not the same woman who had walked into that hall months ago. She had survived fire and neglect and an assassin's blade, and she had done so while learning, slowly and painfully, that her worth had never depended on the opinions of people who refused to see her clearly. "I will attend," she said finally, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Not merely attend, Kale. I want to stand beside you as your equal, not as a curiosity to be examined and judged. If the court requires proof of my strength, then I will give it to them, on my own terms." King Kale's expression shifted into something fiercely proud, the same look she had come to associate with the moments he seemed most certain of the choice fate had made for him. "You have always been my equal," he said. "I only hope the rest of the kingdom proves wise enough to see it as clearly as I do." The weeks leading up to the gathering passed in careful preparation, though Illyra insisted, firmly, that she would not be dressed or presented as a doll for display, the way her family had once tried to make her. Instead, she worked with the palace tailors to design a gown that suited her own preferences rather than court expectation, deep charcoal fabric that caught the light like polished stone, cut in a style that left her scarred cheek and jaw fully visible, rather than hidden beneath careful arrangements of hair or fabric. "Are you certain?" Wren asked gently, the evening before the gathering, as she helped arrange the final details of Illyra's appearance. "There is no shame in choosing to soften it, if that would bring you more comfort." "I have spent 17 years trying to hide this scar," Illyra said, studying her reflection with a steadiness that would have been unimaginable to the frightened girl who once avoided mirrors entirely. "I am done hiding it now. If the court wishes to judge me, let them judge the whole truth of who I am, not a carefully arranged version designed to make my presence easier for them to accept." The gathering, when it arrived, filled the great hall with more nobility than Illyra had seen since the ceremony itself. Representatives from territories she had never visited, kingdoms whose banners she barely recognized, all gathered beneath the black stone pillars to witness whatever this new chapter of King Kale's reign might reveal. The murmuring began the moment she entered on his arm, quieter than before, more measured, though no less present. King Kale led her not toward a quiet corner of observation, as protocol might have suggested for a still uncertain mate, but directly toward the center of the hall, positioning her beside the throne itself, as the assembled nobility watched with open curiosity. "Many of you have heard rumors," King Kale began, his voice carrying easily through the vast chamber, "about the woman who stands beside me tonight. Some of you have questioned whether a fated bond claimed in a moment of ceremony could withstand the demands of true rule. I understand that skepticism. I would have shared it myself, before I met her." He turned toward Illyra, and something in his expression, open and unguarded in front of 1,000 watching strangers, gave her the courage to speak the words she had prepared in the quiet privacy of her own chambers over the preceding weeks. "I was told, my entire life," Illyra said, her voice steady, despite the weight of every eye in that hall fixed upon her, that this scar made me unworthy of love, unworthy of respect, unworthy of even simple kindness. I believed it, for a very long time, because it was easier to believe what I was told than to imagine a different truth for myself. She paused, letting the silence settle, feeling none of the fear that had once accompanied moments like this. I no longer believe it. This scar is not a mark of weakness. It is proof that I survived circumstances that should have broken me entirely, and I intend to rule beside my king with the same strength that carried me through every one of them. The silence that followed was different from the shocked stillness of the first ceremony, heavier with genuine consideration rather than mere astonishment. Slowly, beginning with Bastion near the front of the assembled nobility, applause began to ripple through the hall, hesitant at first, then building into something unmistakably genuine, as more of the court joined in, moved by a sincerity that no amount of careful diplomacy could have manufactured. Not everyone in that hall left fully convinced. Old prejudices, Illyra understood, rarely dissolved in a single evening, however powerful the words spoken against them. But something had shifted nonetheless, a foundation laid that would only grow stronger with time, and as King Kale took her hand before the assembled court, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a tenderness that drew a fresh wave of murmured approval, Illyra felt, for the first time since arriving at the stronghold, that she truly belonged exactly where she stood. Spring returned to the northern territories slowly, the way it always did in that harsh climate, patches of green pushing stubbornly through the last stretches of frost, until the entire kingdom seemed to exhale after a long winter's held breath. With the thaw came preparations for a ceremony far grander than the gathering that had won over so much of the skeptical court, one that had been discussed quietly between Illyra and King Kale for weeks, spoken of in careful, hopeful tones during evenings by the fire. The completion of the mating bond, and with it, Illyra's formal coronation as Queen of the unified Northern Territories, was to take place on the first true day of spring, a date chosen deliberately by King Kale, for reasons he finally explained to her one evening as they walked together through the East Garden, now bursting with the same defiant blooms that had first greeted her arrival at the stronghold nearly a year before. "You arrived here at the end of winter," he said, dressed in gray, hidden at the edge of a line, believing yourself unwanted. "I wanted our bond to be completed at the beginning of spring instead, as a new beginning, entirely separate from everything that came before it, a season that belongs only to us." Illyra, who had once believed herself incapable of feeling anything close to the warmth blooming steadily in her chest since that day in the Great Hall, found herself blinking back tears at the thought, no longer needing to hide the emotion the way she once might have. "It is perfect," she said simply, and meant every word of it. The preparations that followed consumed the stronghold entirely. Banners of silver and deep blue hung throughout every hall, feasts planned to welcome dignitaries from every territory under King Kale's rule, and beyond it, kingdoms curious enough about the story that had spread across the continent to send their own representatives to witness its conclusion firsthand. Illyra's family arrived among the guests as well, invited not out of obligation, but out of the careful, honest relationship she had continued building with them over the preceding months, small and imperfect, but genuine, in ways it had never been during her childhood. Naira, in particular, had written to her, more than once, since that difficult audience, tentative letters that spoke of her own struggles beneath their parents' relentless expectations, and Illyra found, somewhat to her own surprise, that forgiveness came easier the more honestly her sister approached her. On the morning of the ceremony, Ren helped her prepare in a chamber filled with early spring light, the gown chosen for the occasion, crafted from pale silver silk that caught every beam of sunlight streaming through the tall windows, its design, like the gown she had worn to the winter gathering, leaving her scar entirely visible, unhidden, and unapologetic. "You look every inch a queen," Ren said softly, adjusting the final details of Illyra's appearance with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. "I do not think I have ever seen anyone so ready to claim what is rightfully theirs." "I could not have gotten here without you," Illyra said, turning to embrace her friend, the woman who had shown her, in 100 small ways, that kindness, without condition, truly existed in the world. "Thank you, for every single day since I arrived." The Great Hall, when Illyra finally entered it that afternoon, bore little resemblance to the cold, imposing chamber she remembered from her first terrified arrival. Sunlight poured through windows she had not even realized existed until the heavy winter drapes were finally pulled back, illuminating pillars wrapped in fresh spring garlands, and 1,000 faces turned toward her, not with the detached curiosity of that first ceremony, but with genuine warmth and anticipation that still, even now, occasionally caught her off guard. King Knelt stood waiting at the base of the dais, dressed not in the formal black he typically favored for court occasions, but in deep silver that matched her own gown, a small, deliberate gesture of unity that was not lost on the watching crowd. As she walked the length of the hall toward him, the path she had once walked in shame and fear now felt entirely different beneath her feet, each step carrying her not toward dismissal, but toward everything she had once believed herself unworthy of receiving. "Illyra," King Knelt said, once she reached him, his voice carrying easily through the hushed hall. "A year ago, I knelt before you in this very hall, recognizing a bond I did not yet fully understand. Today, I ask you to complete that bond with me, not out of fate's demand, but out of choice, freely given, in front of everyone who will witness the beginning of the rest of our lives together." "I choose you," Illyra said, and the words came without hesitation, without the fear and doubt that had once made her question every kindness offered to her. "Not because fate decided it for us, but because you showed me, every single day since that first night, exactly what it means to be truly seen and truly valued. I choose you, Knelt, with my whole heart, scars and all." The ceremony that followed wove together ancient tradition with the particular tenderness that had defined their relationship from its earliest, uncertain days, vows spoken in the old language of wolves, passed down through countless generations, followed by the marking ritual that would seal their bond permanently, a gesture both ceremonial and deeply personal, performed before the entire assembled court as final, undeniable proof of the union fate itself had chosen. As the final words of the ceremony were spoken, and King Knelt placed a circlet of silver and deep blue stones upon her brow, formally crowning her queen of the unified Northern Territories, the hall erupted into applause far more thunderous and genuine than anything Illyra had witnessed during the earlier winter gathering. She caught sight of her family among the crowd, her mother's eyes wet with what appeared, for once, to be true and uncomplicated pride, her father nodding solemnly, and Nyra smiling with none of the old resentment that had once colored every interaction between them. Ren stood near the front of the gathered nobility, openly weeping with joy, and beside her, Bastian and Ophira and the rest of the council applauded, with the enthusiastic approval of advisors who had come, over the preceding year, to respect their new queen, every bit as much as they respected their king. Later that evening, once the feasting and celebration had finally quieted, and the great hall had emptied of its 1,000 guests, Illyra stood with King Knelt on a balcony overlooking the stronghold's outer walls, the northern sky spread wide and clear above them, scattered with more stars than she remembered ever seeing, wank her childhood, in her family's shadowed manor. "Do you remember?" King Knelt said quietly, his arms settled comfortably around her shoulders. "What I told you that first night, in this very stronghold?" "You told me you would be patient," Illyra said, leaning into his warmth, "for as long as it took me to believe this was real. And do you believe it now?" Illyra considered the question, turning her gaze from the star-scattered sky to the man beside her, the king who had knelt before her when the rest of the world had only ever taught her to expect rejection, who had chosen her not, despite her scars, but with full and complete knowledge of everything that made her who she was. "I do," she said, and felt for the first time in her entire life, the complete and unshakable certainty of that truth settle into her bones. "I believe it with everything I am." Somewhere below them, the stronghold continued its quiet nighttime rhythm, guards changing posts along the outer wall, servants extinguishing the last of the great hall's lanterns, the entire kingdom settling into peaceful rest beneath a queen who had once believed herself unworthy of even the smallest kindness, and a king who had known, from the very first moment their eyes met across a crowded hall, that he had finally found the one soul fate had always intended for his own. Illyra looked out over the kingdom that was now hers, to protect and guide, no longer the frightened, hidden girl in a plain gray dress, no longer the daughter mocked and dismissed for a scar she had never chosen to carry. She was a survivor, a fighter, A woman who had crawled through fire and neglect and cruelty to stand exactly where she now stood, crowned and chosen and finally, completely, at peace with every part of herself. And beside her, for the rest of the long, quiet centuries that stretched ahead of them, King Kale remained exactly where he intended to stay forever, steady and devoted, the man who had knelt before her once in front of 1,000 strangers, and who would gladly kneel again, 1,000 times more, for the fated mate who had taught him that true strength was never about the absence of scars, but about the courage it took to stand tall despite them.